I am Russell, 64 years old, and my hands still carry the thick silver burn scars from the night my son tried to erase his mother's memory. At his lavish housewarming party, surrounded by millionaires, he took the handmade quilt my late wife spent her dying days sewing for him, called it garbage, and threw it directly into his massive gas fireplace. I plunged my bare hands into the flames to pull it out while he laughed. But he didn't know that hidden inside the charred batting of that old smoking quilt was the legal key that would completely destroy his fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets its inevitable downfall. The crisp Connecticut air bit at my face as I turned my 10-year-old Ford truck onto the private road leading to my son Carter's new estate. I had driven 2 hours from my modest, paid-off home in Quincy, carrying a simple cardboard box, resting gently on the passenger seat. At the front of the sprawling property, a valet in a sharp red uniform held up a white-gloved hand, signaling me to stop. He took one look at the rusted wheel wells of my truck, then glanced back at the sea of imported luxury sedans, sports cars, and heavy black SUVs lining the half-mile cobblestone driveway. He sneered, telling me the service entrance for deliveries was around the back. I looked at the young man, gripped the steering wheel, and told him I was the father of the homeowner. The valet simply smirked, clearly, not believing a man in a faded corduroy jacket could be related to the wealthy developer who owned this fortress. I did not argue. I put the truck in park right there on the public shoulder, grabbed the cardboard box, and began the long walk up the driveway. Inside that plain box was the only thing of true value on this entire multi-million-dollar estate. It was a quilt. My late wife Caroline had spent the final 14 months of her life piecing it together. She was enduring aggressive chemotherapy during that time. I would sit beside her bed and watch her hands tremble, her fingers growing numb from the medication, her vision fading. But she stubbornly insisted on finishing every single square. She hand-stitched interlocking circles in deep blues and warm grays. It was a labor of absolute agonizing love for a son who had been too busy closing commercial real estate deals to visit her hospice room. Carter had claimed he was building an empire that he could not afford to step away, not even to say goodbye to the woman who gave him life. This quilt was her final forgiving gift to him. The front doors of the mansion were massive solid oak with heavy wrought iron handles. I pushed them open and stepped into a foyer that looked more like a modern art museum than a home. The housewarming party was in full swing. A string quartet played classical music in the corner of a grand, sunken living room. Waiters in black ties glided silently across the room, circulating with silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. I felt the stares of the guests almost immediately. In this crowd of tailored designer suits, silk gowns, and glittering diamonds, I was a ghost from a past they wanted nothing to do with. I kept my head high, gripping the cardboard box, navigating through the sea of superficial wealth until I found him. Carter was standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace roaring at the far end of the room. He was holding a crystal glass of scotch, holding court, with a group of older, severe-looking investors. Beside him stood his wife Vanessa. She was wearing a sleek, backless dress, dripping in diamonds, that caught the light of the fire, laughing loudly at something one of the investors had just said. I stepped into their circle. I said his name softly. Carter stopped mid-laugh. He turned, and the annoyance in his eyes was immediate, cold, and unmistakable. He did not introduce me to the investors. He did not offer me a drink or ask how my drive was. He just stared at the cardboard box in my hands. He told me I was late and complained that I had brought a dirty cardboard box into his main hall. I ignored the sting of his disrespect. I held the box out to him, keeping my voice steady, and told him this was from his mother. I explained that she had finished it just a week before she passed away, and that she wanted him to have it to warm his new home. Carter took the box, reluctantly holding it away from his tailored suit, as if it were contaminated. Vanessa peered over his shoulder. She reached in with 2 perfectly manicured fingers and pinched the edge of the beautifully stitched cotton fabric. She pulled it back, examining the intricate blue thread Caroline had suffered to sew. I watched Vanessa's nose wrinkle in performative, exaggerated disgust. She scoffed, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, and complained to Carter that the fabric smelled like mothballs and cheap thread. She announced to the wealthy investors that it completely clashed with their minimalist aesthetic, treating my dead wife's final act of devotion like a piece of garbage found on the side of the road. I waited for my son to defend his mother. I waited for him to tell his wife to show a shred of basic human decency. Instead, Carter looked down at the quilt, then looked around at the wealthy investors who were watching the exchange with raised eyebrows and quiet amusement. Carter made his choice right then and there. He pulled the quilt completely out of the box. He did not fold it. He did not hand it to a waiter. He bunched the heavy fabric up in his fists, marched directly over to the roaring gas fireplace, and threw his mother's final gift straight into the artificial leaping flames. "Trash does not belong in my mansion, Dad," Carter announced, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet room. A few of the investors actually chuckled. He turned back to me with a cold, dead smile and told me to learn to buy a real gift or not to show up at all. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch. The absolute horror of his betrayal froze the air in my lungs. I watched the edges of the cotton fabric hit the synthetic logs. I watched the material begin to smoke, the blue thread turning black, curling into ash. Caroline's agonizing hours of work, her immense pain, her unconditional love burning away for the amusement of strangers. The conflict inside me shifted from sorrow to a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I stepped right past my son, ignoring the intense heat radiating from the open hearth. I bypassed the ornate iron safety screen and plunged my bare hands directly into the fire. The synthetic logs seared the skin of my palms instantly. The pain was blinding white hot, an absolute tearing through my nerves, but I did not pull back. I dug my fingers into the burning embers, grabbed the thickest, heaviest center of the smoldering fabric, and dragged it out of the flames. I slapped the burning edges against my jacket to extinguish the fire. The acrid smell of burning cotton and searing flesh filled the grand living room, completely overpowering the expensive perfumes of the guests. The entire party went dead silent. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. I stood up slowly, clutching the smoking, ruined quilt to my chest, letting the remaining hot embers burn tiny holes through my jacket. I looked Carter dead in the eye. He took a nervous step back, the arrogant smirk vanishing from his face as he stared at my bleeding, rapidly blistering hands. I did not say a single word to him. I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the heavy oak doors, leaving a long, undeniable trail of gray ash and charred fabric across his pristine, imported marble floors. I walked out into the freezing night air, completely unaware that the heavy, unburned center of the quilt, pressed against my chest, held a secret that was about to tear his entire world apart. The cold leather of my truck seat offered no comfort as I slammed the door shut. I sat there in the dark cab, the engine off, the only sound, the ragged pull of my own breathing. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the mansion was fading rapidly, and in its place the true agony of the fire began to set in. My palms were a mess of angry red blisters and blackened skin, the heat radiating deep into the muscle and bone. Every pulse of my heart sent a fresh wave of blinding pain through my arms. I reached into the glove box with the side of my wrist, fumbling blindly in the dark, until I pulled out an old, greasy shop rag. It smelled heavily of motor oil rust and stale dust, but I wrapped it tightly around my ruined hands anyway, gritting my teeth against the sharp, stabbing sensation. The silence of the cab was shattered by the harsh vibration of my cell phone against the center console. The screen lit up the dark interior, casting a pale glow across the dashboard. I leaned over, squinting through the residual smoke still clinging to my clothes. It was a text message from my son. A part of me, the foolish, stubborn part of a father that never quite dies, even when it should thought he might be apologizing. I thought he might have chased after me into the freezing Connecticut night, suddenly realizing the absolute horror of what he had just done to his mother's memory. But the words glaring on the screen were devoid of any soul. "Send me the bill for the burn cream, then lose my number. You embarrassed Vanessa." There was not a single syllable of remorse. He did not ask if I was severely injured. He did not care that he had just incinerated the final painstaking labor of the woman who gave him life. His only concern was the social standing of his vain wife in front of a room full of millionaire investors. That text message was the final snap of the tether between us. The conflict did not end with the flames in his grand living room. It escalated right there in the dark cab of my Ford into absolute irreversible estrangement. I did not reply to his cruelty. I did not shed a tear. I simply dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, pushed the brake pedal with my heavy boot, and turned the key in the ignition. I did not drive to the emergency room. The physical pain in my flesh was absolutely nothing compared to the desperate, clawing need to salvage what was left of Caroline's legacy. I pulled out of the wealthy suburban enclave, steering the heavy truck with the bottoms of my forearms. I left the manicured lawns, the imported marble, and the towering iron gates far behind me in the rearview mirror. I headed straight across the city, diving deep into the crowded neon-lit streets of the garment district. This was a place of real work, a place of calloused hands, aching backs, and honest living. It was exactly where Caroline had always felt most at home. 34 years ago, long before Carter was born, and long before his relentless greed consumed him, Caroline had dragged me into a tiny, cluttered shop in this exact neighborhood to pick up her wedding dress. That was where we first met Sylvia. Sylvia was a master tailor, a fiercely independent woman who had poured her entire life into needles, thread, and heavy bolts of fabric. Over the decades, she had become a permanent fixture in our lives. She mended my torn work clothes when money was tight, and she eventually taught Caroline the intricate, difficult quilting techniques my wife used to pass the time during her final days in hospice. If anyone on this earth could save the ashes of my wife's unconditional love, it was Sylvia. I pulled the truck onto the cracked concrete curb right outside her shop. The street was empty, the surrounding storefronts dark, save for a single bulb burning in the back room where Sylvia often worked late into the night, fulfilling rush orders. My hands were completely useless, swollen to twice their size and throbbing with a sickening, relentless rhythm. I climbed out of the truck, tucked the smoking ash-covered bundle of the quilt tightly under my arm, and walked heavily up to her door. I could not grip the brass knob, so I raised my heavy work boot and kicked the door open. The old glass panes rattled violently against the wooden frame, and the brass bell tied to the top chimed wildly, shattering the quiet of the street. Sylvia jumped up from her industrial sewing machine in the back room, knocking over a tray of wooden spools. She rushed out to the front counter, her eyes wide with alarm, but she froze dead in her tracks the moment she saw me. I must have looked like a walking nightmare. My faded corduroy jacket was covered in thick gray ash and dotted with small glowing burn holes that were still eating through the fabric. The acrid smell of charred cotton and seared human flesh hung heavily around me in the small space. But what made Sylvia gasp out loud, pressing her hands to her mouth, was the sight of my hands. Wrapped in the filthy oil-stained rag, they were trembling uncontrollably against my chest, blood and clear fluid seeping through the dark grease. I walked directly past her displays of fine silk and wool, straight to her large, scarred wooden cutting table, and let the bundle drop. The ruined quilt hit the wood with a heavy, dull thud. Fine flakes of black soot drifted up into the air under the bright, buzzing fluorescent lights of the shop. "Fix it," I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed gravel in the quiet room. "Whatever it takes." Sylvia did not ask a single question. She saw the absolute manic desperation burning in my eyes and immediately sprang into action. She ran to the back room and returned a moment later, carrying a large, heavy metal first aid kit. She gently reached out her experienced, delicate fingers, trying to pull the greasy rag away from my blistered skin. She inhaled sharply at the sight of the severe damage tears springing to her eyes, but I pulled away from her touch. I told her firmly to ignore my hands and look at the quilt. My injuries were temporary. The scars would heal. But the ruined fabric lying on her table was irreplaceable. Sylvia wiped her eyes and reluctantly turned her attention to the smoking bundle. She carefully unfolded the heavy, stiff material, revealing the true, heartbreaking extent of Carter's destruction. The edges were completely scorched away, the beautiful blue interlocking circles blackened, brittle, and crumbling into dust at the slightest touch. The smell of the fire was entirely overpowering, now filling the small shop with the horrible stench of synthetic logs and ruined memories. Sylvia reached for a small, sharp pair of fabric scissors and a silver seam ripper. She began to gingerly cut away the destroyed outer edges, meticulously trying to find any clean, salvageable fabric to work with. I stood looming over the table, my raw hands resting lightly on the cool wood, my eyes completely fixed on the center of the quilt. Caroline had spent an unusual amount of time on that middle section during her final weeks. I remembered watching her pad it heavily, stitching it with a tight, incredibly complex pattern that made it stiff and rigid, almost like a shield. As Sylvia worked, her seam ripper snagged on a particularly thick knot of melted thread. She pulled gently, peeling back a large flap of blackened, charred cotton from that exact center square. Suddenly, something caught the harsh overhead light, sending a sharp reflection across the ceiling of the shop. The fire had burned completely through the soft outer layer and the thick cotton batting, exposing something hidden deep inside the fabric. It was not padding. It was not thread. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, my heart pounding a strange, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Nestled perfectly within the ruined layers of the quilt, completely untouched by the flames, was the cold, unmistakable gleam of a solid, metallic object. Sylvia moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades working with her hands. She opened the heavy metal first aid kit on her cutting table and pulled out rolls of thick white gauze alongside a large tube of clear burn ointment. The sharp, sterile smell of the antiseptic immediately cut through the heavy stench of smoke clinging to my clothes. I sat perfectly still on a wooden stool while she coated my blistered palms with the cold gel. The sudden temperature change sent a violent shiver down my spine, but I welcomed the sensation. It grounded me. She wrapped the gauze tightly around my hands, binding my fingers together, creating thick, white protective layers over my ruined skin. She did not offer empty words of comfort or meaningless apologies. She knew that the intense physical pain was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality at that moment. Once she secured the final piece of medical tape, she turned her attention back to the table. The quilt lay there, under the harsh fluorescent lights, like a wounded animal. Sylvia picked up a small silver seam ripper that looked like a tiny curved blade. She leaned over the table, adjusting her thick wire-rimmed glasses, and began to carefully peel back the layers of charred cotton to assess the structural damage. The sound of tearing fabric filled the quiet shop. It was a slow, agonizing process. She had to navigate through melted synthetic fibers and scorched cotton batting, trying to find the boundaries of the destruction. I watched her work with my bandaged hands resting heavily on my knees. I was preparing myself to hear her say that the quilt was a total loss. I was bracing for the final confirmation that my son had successfully erased the last physical evidence of his mother's devotion. But then her hands stopped moving entirely. The shop went completely silent. The silver seam ripper slipped from her fingers and clattered softly against the scarred wooden table. I looked up at her face. The color had completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen gray. She was staring down into the gutted center of the fabric. Her shoulders began to tremble slightly. I stood up from the stool, my heart suddenly pounding, a heavy, hollow rhythm in my chest. I asked her what was wrong. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the torn opening in the quilt. "Russell," she whispered, her voice tight with a sudden, unexplainable panic. "Do you know what is sewn inside this?" I stepped closer to the table, leaning over the ruined fabric. Sylvia reached her hands into the thick white batting that had somehow survived the intense heat of the gas fireplace. She pulled the dense cotton fibers apart. Embedded deep in the absolute dead center of the quilt was something that did not belong in a handmade blanket. It was a flat rectangular pouch made of a dull gray material. It was not fabric. It was a high-grade fireproof and waterproof polymer. The edges were sealed tight. Caroline had not just been sewing a blanket during those agonizing final months in her hospice bed. She had been building a vault. She had constructed a hidden safe right under our noses, weaving it into the very fabric she knew I would eventually retrieve. Sylvia reached in and slid the pouch out from its hiding place. It landed on the wooden table with a heavy, solid thud that defied its slim profile. This was not a simple letter. This was hardware. The polymer was completely untouched by the flames, protected by the dense layers of treated cotton Caroline had obsessively wrapped around it. Sylvia stepped back, giving me room. I stood over the gray envelope. My hands were heavily bandaged and clumsy, wrapped in layers of thick gauze, but I refused to let anyone else open it. I pressed my bound thumbs against the top edge of the vacuum seal. It required a tremendous amount of force. The blisters on my palms screamed in protest, sending fresh waves of agony up my arms, but I pushed harder. With a sharp popping sound, the thick seal broke open. I tipped the heavy envelope over the cutting table. 3 objects slid out onto the wood. The first was a heavy brass key. It was thick and cold, with a series of complex, jagged teeth and a prominent set of numbers stamped into the wide head. It was a safety deposit box key. The second object was a sleek, black, encrypted computer drive. It was a modern piece of technology that looked completely out of place, sitting next to the remnants of traditional needlework. The third object was a folded piece of heavy cream-colored paper. I recognized the texture immediately. It was Caroline's personal stationery, the paper she used for her most important documents. I managed to unfold the paper using the edges of my bandaged fingers. The ink was dark, and the handwriting was undeniably hers. The elegant looping cursive hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Seeing her handwriting made her feel devastatingly alive in that small room. I read the words slowly. Russell, if Carter ever forgets who built his foundation, plug this in. I kept the real books. I read the short paragraph again, and then a third time. The air in the tailor shop felt suddenly thin. The words were a direct message across time and space. My gentle, quiet wife had possessed a foresight that terrified me. The memories came rushing back with startling clarity. 10 years ago, when Carter was desperately trying to launch his very first commercial real estate venture, he could not afford an accounting firm. He was operating out of our garage, running on blind ambition and the massive loan I had taken out against my own business. Caroline had stepped in to help. She had been a meticulous corporate bookkeeper before we had children. For 2 full years, she stayed up late into the night, working at our kitchen table, surrounded by receipts, tax forms, and bank statements. She managed every single penny of his early operations. She built the complex financial architecture that allowed his company to survive its fragile infancy. Carter had eventually hired a massive corporate firm and completely dismissed her early contributions, treating her late nights as nothing more than a mother doing a small favor. But Caroline had never stopped paying attention. She knew the numbers better than anyone. She knew the secret accounts, the shadow transfers, and the hidden ledgers that built his so-called empire. She knew exactly what her son was capable of long before his greed finally consumed him completely. And she knew that one day his incredible arrogance would turn on the very people who gave him everything. She had prepared for this exact moment. She had sewn the ultimate weapon of his destruction into a gift she knew his vanity would eventually reject. I looked down at the brass key and the black computer drive resting on the table. The smell of the burned cotton no longer felt like a tragic loss. It felt like the smoke from a fired gun. The entire narrative of the evening instantly shifted. This was no longer a story about a grieving father holding a ruined sentimental item. This was the story of a man who had just been handed a buried financial bomb, and the fuse was already lit. The drive back to Quincy felt entirely different than the frantic rush into the city. The blinding pain in my hands had receded into a dull, heavy ache beneath the thick layers of white gauze Sylvia had wrapped around them. The heater in the old Ford truck blasted warm air over my legs, but I felt completely cold inside. I navigated the quiet, empty streets of my working-class neighborhood and pulled into the narrow, cracked driveway of my single-story house. It was a modest place. The vinyl siding was faded from years of harsh winters, and the roof shingles needed replacing, but I owned it free and clear. I had spent the last 10 years working myself into the ground just to keep the bank from foreclosing on this tiny piece of property. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark cab for a long time, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the heavy polymer pouch containing the brass key and the black computer drive. I walked up the concrete steps, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the silent house. I did not bother turning on the main hallway lights. I walked straight through the dark living room into the small spare bedroom I used as a home office and sat down heavily at my scarred wooden desk. I opened my old heavy laptop and pressed the power button. The internal fan whirred to life, cutting through the absolute silence of the empty house. The pale blue light of the monitor illuminated my face, casting long shadows against the walls. My bandaged fingers were stiff and uncoordinated, but I managed to grip the small black computer drive and push it carefully into the side port of the machine. A security prompt immediately flashed on the screen, demanding a password to decrypt the contents. I stared at the blinking cursor. Caroline was a brilliant financial mind, but she was also a woman deeply rooted in her family history. I slowly typed in the date we broke ground on my very first independent contracting job 30 years ago, using my wrapped knuckles to strike the keys. The screen blinked green, and the heavy encryption dissolved instantly. A massive organized directory of folders and complex spreadsheets populated the screen. I opened the main file labeled Master Ledger and leaned closer to the monitor. Row after row of incredibly detailed financial records appeared, mapping out every single transaction, deposit, and wire transfer related to Carter and his very first commercial real estate venture. To understand the absolute magnitude of what I was looking at, you have to understand what happened 10 years ago. Carter was fresh out of college, full of massive ambition, and wearing expensive suits he bought on credit, but he completely lacked the capital to back up his arrogant vision. He came to me one rainy night, sitting at my worn kitchen table, begging for seed money to purchase a dilapidated commercial warehouse he swore he could turn into a lucrative retail hub. I was a blue-collar contractor. I did not have millions in liquid cash sitting around waiting to be invested. But I believed in my son. I believed in his potential, and I wanted to give him the head start I never had. So I went to the commercial bank the next morning, and I put my entire contracting business up as collateral. I mortgaged the company I had spent 2 brutal decades building with my own sweat and blood. I handed Carter a cashier check for everything I was worth. 18 months later, he came back to that same kitchen table, burying his face in his hands, crying uncontrollably like a frightened child. He told me the city zoning permits were permanently denied, the secondary contractors had walked off the job, and the local real estate market had crashed. He claimed the entire venture had gone completely bankrupt, and the money was entirely gone. To protect him from the predatory creditors and the threat of severe legal action, I took the entire massive financial burden upon myself. For the next 10 years, I worked grueling double shifts. I woke up at 4 a.m. to pour freezing concrete in the dead of winter, and I stayed on dusty job sites until midnight during the sweltering summers. I permanently ruined my lower back and exhausted my aging body just to pay off the mountain of debt he had supposedly left behind. But as I scrolled down through Caroline and her meticulous spreadsheets, the reality of my ruined life stared back at me in cold, hard numbers. The business had not failed. Carter had never lost the money. The commercial warehouse property had actually been rezoned successfully within the first 6 months of his purchase. He had developed it quietly behind my back and sold it to a massive corporate buyer for a staggering multi-million-dollar profit. But instead of paying off the initial bank loan and saving his father from total financial ruin, Carter had systematically diverted every single penny of that massive profit into a complex web of offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. He had intentionally manufactured a completely fake domestic bankruptcy. He falsified the corporate loss reports, knowing full well I would step in and absorb the crushing debt to keep him out of federal prison. He watched me age a decade in the span of 3 years. He watched me sell off my heavy machinery, tractors, and tools piece by piece just to make the crushing monthly interest payments. He watched my hands grow thick with calluses and my spine bend with fatigue while he was quietly siphoning millions of dollars into his hidden, untraceable accounts. The sprawling Connecticut mansion he was currently partying in, the imported marble floors I had just bled on, the diamond necklace resting on the collarbone of his ungrateful wife. Every single piece of his luxurious, arrogant lifestyle was paid for with my stolen retirement and my broken body. He did not just disrespect me tonight by throwing his dying mother and her final beautiful gift into the fire. He had been robbing me blind every single day for 10 long years. I sat back in the creaking wooden chair. The blinding white-hot anger I had felt standing in front of his roaring gas fireplace completely vanished. It evaporated into the thin, cold air of my quiet office. In its place, a glacial, calculating clarity settled deep into my bones. The raw, emotional pain of a betrayed parent was completely gone, replaced by the absolute precision of a man who suddenly understands the exact dimensions of the battlefield. I reached into the gray polymer pouch and pulled out the heavy brass key. I held it up to the pale blue light of the computer monitor, studying the grooves and edges. My eyes scanned the very top of the master spreadsheet glowing on the screen. There, in bold black letters, Caroline had typed the name of the First Fidelity Bank downtown and a specific secure vault number, Box 412. I looked down at the numbers stamped deep into the wide head of the brass key resting in my bandaged palm. 412. It was a perfect match. The computer drive contained the hidden history of his crimes, but this key was the physical weapon that would execute his absolute punishment. Caroline had meticulously documented the massive theft, but she had also secured the foundational deeds he thought he had successfully buried. I did not feel like a sad, discarded father anymore. I felt like the rightful legal owner of a massive financial empire who was finally stepping out of the dark shadows to collect his long overdue debt. The trap my brilliant wife had built was fully loaded. All I had to do now was walk into that bank and turn the key. The sun rose pale and cold over Quincy the next morning, bringing no warmth to the empty house. I had not slept a single minute. I sat at my wooden desk watching the financial numbers on the laptop screen until the digital clock in the corner of the monitor struck 8. I shut down the machine, secured the black computer drive in my interior jacket pocket, and walked out to my truck. Downtown traffic was heavy, but I navigated the congested city streets with a calm, mechanical precision. By 8:45, I parked my truck 3 blocks away from the towering glass and steel structure of First Fidelity Bank. I walked the remaining distance, feeling the cold morning wind biting at my face and the dull, throbbing pain radiating from beneath the thick gauze on my hands. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors exactly at 9 o'clock, just as the armed security guard unlocked the main lobby. The interior was a cavern of polished white marble and silent, oppressive wealth. Men in expensive tailored suits and women carrying designer briefcases rushed past me, paying absolutely no attention to the older man in a faded corduroy jacket. I walked directly past the long regular teller lines and approached the heavy mahogany desk labeled Vault Manager. A young man wearing a sharp blue suit and a perfectly knotted tie looked up from his computer monitor. He offered a practiced, hollow smile and asked how he could assist me today. I did not waste time with polite pleasantries. I reached into my pocket and placed my driver license and the heavy brass key directly onto the polished wood of his desk. The dull metal clanked sharply in the quiet lobby. I told him my name and stated that I needed immediate access to Box 412. The manager glanced at my worn clothes and the thick white medical gauze wrapping my hands. A brief flash of condescension crossed his face, clearly assuming I was a confused blue-collar worker trying to access a deceased relative account. He slowly typed my name into his secure terminal, expecting an error message to pop up on his screen. Instead, his fingers stopped moving completely. His posture immediately straightened. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sudden, profound respect. He stood up swiftly, buttoned his suit jacket, and told me it was an absolute honor to serve the primary account holder. He stepped out from behind the desk and asked me to follow him. We walked past the busy loan officers and approached a massive steel door guarded by a second armed security officer. The manager swiped his identification badge, and the thick metal door hissed open, revealing a brightly lit private elevator. We descended deep into the subterranean basement of the building, far away from the noise and frantic activity of the city above. The air down here was climate-controlled, sterile, and completely silent. The elevator doors parted to reveal the main vault area. It was a massive circular steel enclosure that looked capable of surviving a massive explosion. The manager stepped forward and spun a heavy steel wheel, disengaging the massive locking bolts. We walked into a long corridor lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of identical rectangular metal doors. Our footsteps echoed sharply off the cold metal walls. He led me down the third aisle, stopping precisely in front of the box Caroline had listed in her hidden ledger. He inserted his master key into the first slot and waited for me. I raised my bandaged right hand and pushed the heavy brass key into the second slot. We turned them simultaneously. A heavy metallic click echoed down the hallway, unlocking a decade of buried secrets. The manager pulled the long, heavy metal container from the wall and carried it to a small private viewing room just outside the main vault. He set it gently on a heavy oak table, bowed his head slightly to me, and closed the door behind him, leaving me completely alone in the windowless room. The silence was absolute. I stood over the gray metal box for a long moment. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I reached out with my clumsy wrapped fingers and lifted the lid. There were no stacks of cash inside. There were no gold bars or bearer bonds. There was only a thick, dense stack of original watermarked legal papers, bound tightly by thick rubber bands. The paper smelled slightly musty, a scent of old ink and compressed time. I pulled the heavy stack out and laid it flat on the smooth table, carefully peeling back the heavy cardstock cover. The documents resting in front of me were a masterclass in financial architecture drawn up by an incredibly brilliant mind. They were the original foundational incorporation papers for a corporate entity called Apex Holdings. I read the heavy legal jargon, slowly absorbing every single clause and addendum my wife had secretly orchestrated. When Carter had first come to me 10 years ago begging for seed money, the bank required a primary guarantor. Because Carter had absolutely no assets and no credit history, I was the one who signed the massive loan, assuming all the catastrophic financial risk. Caroline knew that Carter was incredibly reckless and profoundly selfish. She knew that if he defaulted on the secondary loans, the predatory creditors would immediately come after our family home and my independent contracting business. To prevent him from completely destroying our lives, she had quietly instructed the corporate lawyers to register Apex Holdings entirely in my name. As the sole guarantor, the primary holding company belonged to me 100%. Carter was legally listed on the original paperwork as nothing more than an appointed operational manager, an employee with zero actual ownership. I flipped to the second section of the thick file, discovering exactly how Carter had managed to operate for a full decade without me ever knowing the truth. Caroline had documented his massive trail of fraud with terrifying precision. Once the initial commercial property became wildly successful, Carter had needed to move massive amounts of capital to fund his luxurious lifestyle and build his fake empire. To accomplish this, he had systematically forged my signature on dozens of secondary operational documents. He had faked my signature to open massive new lines of credit, to authorize illegal offshore wire transfers, and to purchase extravagant personal assets through the corporate account. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone around him. He thought he had successfully buried the truth beneath a mountain of fake bankruptcies and forged signatures, leaving me to suffer in debt while he lived like a king. But Carter was exceptionally arrogant, and his arrogance had made him sloppy. He had focused entirely on manipulating the daily operational funds, but he never once bothered to check the original foundational deed locked away in this silent basement. He never knew that his quiet, unassuming mother had held on to the master key to his entire life. I looked at the notarized seal stamped at the bottom of the final page, legally binding the company to me in perpetuity. The reality of his absolute vulnerability washed over me like a freezing wave. The massive multi-million-dollar estate where he had thrown his mother's dying gift into the fire was legally titled under Apex Holdings. The fleet of imported sports cars sitting in his driveway were leased through Apex Holdings. The towering glass commercial buildings he paraded around as his own creation were all collateral leveraged against a company that I legally owned free and clear. He had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and status, but he had built it entirely on my land. I was not just a wronged father holding a burned piece of fabric anymore. I was the absolute dictator of his financial reality, and I had just located the demolition switch. I carefully placed the documents back into the metal container, locked it tight, and walked out of the vault, ready to bring his entire world crashing down. I did not hire a lawyer to send a politely worded letter. A letter can be ignored or handed off to a legal team to bury in endless corporate paperwork. A letter does not convey the absolute finality of what was about to happen. I waited patiently until Friday night. I knew from Caroline and her detailed notes that Carter always hosted his most crucial financial meetings at the end of the month. Tonight, he and Vanessa were hosting a highly exclusive private dinner for their top-tier investors. These were the incredibly wealthy, ruthless individuals who were supposed to fund his next massive mega-development project. He needed their money to keep his giant fraudulent machine running. I drove back to the sprawling Connecticut estate under a blanket of heavy, dark clouds. The air was thick with the promise of rain. I pulled my old Ford truck right past the long line of luxury vehicles and parked it aggressively on the pristine, manicured grass near the front entrance. The same valet from a few nights ago ran toward me, waving his hands and shouting, but I completely ignored him. I stepped out of the truck, clutching a thick, heavy folder under my left arm. My hands were still heavily wrapped in white medical gauze, completely hiding the severe burn blisters beneath. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed through the heavy mahogany front doors. I did not knock. I did not wait to be announced. The massive foyer was quiet save for the muffled sounds of polite laughter and clinking crystal coming from the formal dining room down the hall. I walked across the imported marble floors, my heavy work boots thudding loudly against the polished stone. The grand dining room was a spectacular display of manufactured wealth. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over a long mahogany table. 12 guests sat in high-backed velvet chairs wearing expensive tailored suits and elegant evening gowns. At the head of the table sat Carter. He was wearing a custom black tuxedo, holding a glass of dark red wine, smiling widely as he pitched his grand vision for a new commercial skyscraper. Vanessa sat at the opposite end, playing the perfect hostess, nodding along and gesturing to the waitstaff, who were serving an extravagant multi-course meal on gold-rimmed porcelain plates. I stepped into the archway of the dining room and simply stood there. It only took a few seconds for the nearest guest to notice me. A wealthy woman dripping in silver jewelry stopped mid-sentence and stared at my faded corduroy jacket and my bandaged hands. One by one, the other investors turned their heads to follow her gaze. The polite laughter died instantly. The soft background music seemed to fade away into nothing. The dining room fell completely dead silent. Carter was looking down at his notes, but the sudden heavy silence caused him to look up. When his eyes locked onto mine, the smug, confident smile vanished from his face as if it had been slapped away. His skin flashed a deep, angry red. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger at me and told me he had ordered me never to come back to this house. He raised his voice and began shouting for his private security team to come and remove the trespasser. I did not shout back. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the long dining table. The wealthy investors watched me with wide, fearful eyes, shrinking back into their velvet chairs as I passed. I reached the head of the table where Carter was standing. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with manufactured outrage, but I could see the tiny flicker of genuine panic hiding deep in his eyes. He had no idea why I was so calm. I looked down at his beautiful, pristine table setting. I lifted my bandaged right hand and dropped the thick, certified folder directly onto his gold-rimmed dinner plate. The heavy stack of paper hit the porcelain with a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the high ceiling of the cavernous room. Carter stared down at the plain manila folder. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke clearly so that every single incredibly wealthy person in that room could hear my exact words. I told him I was not standing there as his father. I told him I was standing there as the sole legal owner of Apex Holdings. I watched his breath catch in his throat. I told him he had exactly 72 hours to vacate my property. The silence in the room became so heavy, it was almost suffocating. Carter opened his mouth to speak, to call me crazy, or to lie to his guests, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that his absolute worst nightmare had just walked into his dining room. Sitting directly to the right of Carter was the lead investor. He was an older man with cold, calculating eyes, a notorious venture capitalist known for his ruthless business tactics. He did not ask for permission. He reached across the table and grabbed the heavy folder right off the porcelain plate. Carter tried to snatch it back, shouting that it was private family nonsense, but the investor swatted his hand away with absolute authority. The older man flipped open the cover. He began to scan the crisp white pages. He read the original notarized foundational deeds proving my total ownership of the holding company. Then he turned the page and looked at the printed spreadsheets I had extracted from the black computer drive. He saw Caroline and her meticulous accounting of the stolen funds, the forged signatures, and the fake bankruptcies. I watched the blood completely drain from the powerful investor face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. The millions of dollars he was preparing to give my son were about to be poured into a massive black hole of federal fraud. He realized in a matter of seconds that the mansion they were sitting in, the cars in the driveway, and the corporate towers Carter claimed to own were all entirely fake. They were useless collateral leveraged against a company Carter had absolutely no legal right to operate. The investor slowly closed the folder. He did not yell or throw a tantrum. He simply looked up at Carter with a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. It was the look a man gives a cockroach before crushing it under his heel. The illusion of my son and his incredible success shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the dining room table. I did not need to stay to watch the rest of the carnage. I turned my back on the ruined dinner party and walked out into the cool, dark night, leaving him to face the monsters he had invited into my home. I did not look back as I walked down the long, brightly lit hallway of the mansion. I did not need to see the chaos unfolding in the formal dining room to know exactly what was happening. Even before I reached the heavy mahogany front doors, I could hear the scraping of heavy wooden chairs violently pushing back against the imported marble floors. I heard the sharp, authoritative voice of the lead investor commanding his associates to gather their coats immediately. There were no polite goodbyes exchanged. There were no promises to reschedule the meeting or discuss the matter further. The wealthy elite operate on a strict code of financial self-preservation, and they had just smelled blood in the water. The massive financial backing my son had spent months carefully courting was completely evaporating before the kitchen staff could even bring out the first course of the extravagant meal. I pushed open the front doors and stepped out into the damp, cool night air. The valet who had sneered at my rusted truck earlier was now rushing frantically toward the entrance, summoned by the panicked demands of the exiting guests. I walked slowly across the manicured grass, completely ignoring the frantic, chaotic activity erupting behind me. I climbed into the cab of my old Ford and pulled the heavy door shut, enclosing myself in the quiet, dark sanctuary of my truck. I pushed the key into the ignition, but before I could turn it, the silence of the cab was shattered. My cell phone began to vibrate violently against the plastic center console, emitting a harsh, relentless ringtone. The bright screen illuminated the dark interior of the truck, casting a pale glow over my bandaged hands. The screen flashed a name I had once associated with pride and hope. It was Carter. Just a few days ago, a call from him would have filled my heart with the desperate, eager anticipation of a father waiting to be thrown a few crumbs of affection. Now the flashing name on the screen meant absolutely nothing to me. I sat there in the dark, watching the phone vibrate on the console, listening to the sheer desperation radiating from the small electronic device. I let it ring 5 times, letting the unbearable anxiety build on his end of the line. I wanted him to feel the sickening drop in his stomach, the terrible uncertainty of knowing his entire world was hanging by a single frayed thread. On the 6th ring, I slowly reached out with my wrapped fingers and pressed the green button on the screen. I lifted the phone to my ear, but I did not say a word. I simply sat there in the dark and listened to the sound of his complete destruction. His voice came through the small speaker, completely stripped of its usual arrogance and polished charm. He was breathless, panting heavily, as if he had just sprinted a mile. The background noise on his end was chaotic, filled with the sounds of Vanessa crying hysterically and the slamming of heavy doors. He shouted my name, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic panic that I had never heard from him before. He demanded to know what I had just done. He screamed that the investors had walked out without a single word of explanation and that his entire funding round was completely ruined. He accused me of fabricating the documents, claiming they were fake pieces of garbage designed specifically to embarrass him in front of his peers. He told me I was destroying his company, his reputation, and his entire life. He was completely unhinged, flailing blindly in the dark, desperately trying to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers forever. I waited patiently until he ran out of breath, until his frantic screaming dissolved into ragged, heavy panting. When the line finally fell quiet, except for his frantic breathing, I spoke. My voice was low, even, and completely devoid of any parental warmth or sympathy. I told him the documents were absolutely real. I told him his mother had kept the receipts for every single penny he had stolen over the last 10 years. I explained with surgical precision that he had forged my signature to completely drain my retirement and that he had built his extravagant house entirely on my name. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke acted like a heavy iron nail being driven deep into his coffin. I informed him that the lead investor was not just leaving the dinner party, he was likely making phone calls to the Federal Banking Commission from the back of his limousine. I told Carter that First Fidelity Bank had already frozen all of his operational accounts and personal assets, pending a massive federal fraud investigation. The silence that followed my words was profound. It was the sound of a man plummeting from a towering height, suddenly realizing there was absolutely no safety net to catch him at the bottom. He tried to stammer out a response, he tried to formulate another lie, but his brain could not process the absolute magnitude of the collapse. Before he could start begging or crying or trying to negotiate a way out, I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I tossed the device onto the passenger seat and finally turned the key in the ignition. The old engine roared to life, vibrating beneath my feet. Almost immediately, the phone lit up again, buzzing relentlessly against the worn upholstery. It was Carter calling back. When I did not answer, a barrage of frantic text messages began lighting up the screen in rapid succession. I did not turn the phone off, and I did not block his number. Blocking him would have been a defensive maneuver, a way to shield myself from his anger. Leaving the line open but refusing to answer was an active, continuous punishment. I wanted him to call me 100 times. I wanted him to listen to the empty ringing, to stare at the unread messages, and to fully experience the deafening absolute silence of my refusal to save him. For 10 years, I had answered every single call, I had paid every single debt, and I had sacrificed my own body to shield him from the consequences of his actions. That era was permanently over. I put the truck in gear and slowly drove away from the massive iron gates of the estate, leaving him trapped inside a mansion he did not own. The conflict had instantly escalated far beyond a bitter family dispute over a burned quilt. This was now a full-blown federal financial crisis, spreading rapidly across the city. The dominoes were falling with terrifying speed, crushing his fake corporate empire, his marriage, and his freedom. And as I drove back to my quiet, modest home, I felt absolutely no guilt. I only felt the cold, clean wind blowing through the open window and the undeniable satisfaction of watching a predator finally step into a trap of his own making. The weekend passed in a heavy quiet. By Monday morning, the financial fallout from the frozen accounts had evolved from a silent digital freeze into a very loud, very public catastrophe. I woke up long before dawn and brewed a strong pot of black coffee, filling my old metal thermos to the brim. I drove back to the wealthy Connecticut suburb, parking my faded Ford truck down the street from my son's massive estate. I found a spot under the sweeping branches of a large oak tree, perfectly positioned to observe the main gates without drawing attention to myself. The neighborhood was completely still. The manicured lawns were covered in a light morning frost, and the only sound was the gentle hum of my truck heater. I unscrewed the cup of my thermos and took a slow sip of the hot, bitter coffee. I was completely calm. I knew exactly what the automated banking systems had been doing over the weekend. Every single massive auto payment scheduled for the first of the month had slammed into the solid brick wall of a federal asset freeze. The bounced payments had triggered immediate alarms at the luxury leasing companies. I did not have to wait long to see the results. Just after 7 o'clock, the quiet morning air was shattered by the loud grinding roar of heavy diesel engines. 2 massive heavy-duty tow trucks turned onto the pristine street. They were large industrial machines covered in grease and rust, sporting flashing yellow lights that painted the surrounding trees in harsh, rhythmic bursts. The trucks slowed down and backed up directly toward the wrought iron gates of the mansion. The security system had already failed due to unpaid utility bills, allowing the repo men to push the heavy gates open manually. I watched from the cab of my truck as the 2 massive vehicles rolled up the half-mile cobblestone driveway. The harsh reality of working-class debt collection was invading the artificial, pristine sanctuary my son had built. The drivers hopped out of their cabs wearing heavy canvas jackets and thick work gloves, holding clipboards filled with authorization forms. They walked directly toward the 2 magnificent vehicles parked near the front entrance. One was a sleek silver Bentley leased under Vanessa's name, but paid for by Apex Holdings. The other was Carter's pride and joy, a custom black Porsche that he loved to flaunt at his real estate seminars. These cars were not just modes of transportation. They were the ultimate symbols of his manufactured success and his arrogant superiority. The tow truck drivers did not care about the sleek lines or the expensive leather interiors. They saw steel and rubber that belonged to a bank. They moved with practiced efficiency, dragging heavy metal chains across the expensive cobblestone and positioning the hydraulic lifts under the luxury cars. The loud clanking of the chains must have echoed through the cavernous, empty rooms of the mansion. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany front doors swung violently open. Vanessa ran out onto the cold driveway. She was wearing a thin, emerald green silk robe and expensive designer slippers, completely unprepared for the freezing morning air. Her perfectly styled hair from the dinner party was a tangled mess, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure outrage. I watched through the windshield as she began screaming at the drivers, waving her arms frantically. She pointed at the Bentley, stomping her foot on the stone, demanding that they unhook her vehicle immediately. She probably threatened to sue them or call the police, completely unaware that the men attaching the chains had more legal authority on that driveway than she did. The drivers completely ignored her. They had seen this exact scene play out 100 times before. Wealthy people throwing tantrums when the bill finally comes due. One of the men simply handed her a yellow copy of the repossession order and turned back to the hydraulic controls. The Bentley was lifted off the ground, its front wheels hovering uselessly in the air. A moment later, Carter emerged from the house. He looked absolutely terrible. He was wearing the same wrinkled dress pants from Friday night and a loose gray sweater. He had not shaved, and his posture was completely defeated. He walked slowly down the steps, rubbing his face as if hoping he would wake up from a terrible nightmare. He approached the repo men, trying to put on his usual charming, authoritative persona. I could see him holding his hands up, palms out, trying to negotiate. He was probably begging for an extension, promising that a simple banking error would be cleared up by noon. But a federal asset freeze is not a simple banking error. The repo man shook his head, handed Carter another yellow sheet of paper, and pulled the final lever. The black Porsche was hoisted into the air. Carter had absolutely zero leverage. His entire fortune was locked inside a vault he could no longer access. Vanessa turned slowly to look at her husband. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her vanity. The dinner party humiliation was not a misunderstanding. The blocked credit cards over the weekend were not a glitch. The man she had married was entirely broke. I watched the physical transformation of her body language. The panic vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred. She marched right up to Carter. He tried to reach out to touch her arm, to offer some empty comfort, but she slapped his hand away. She leaned in close and said something to him. I could not hear the words through the glass of my truck, but the absolute venom in her posture was unmistakable. She had married a lifestyle, and that lifestyle was currently being towed down the driveway. Without the money, the mansions, and the luxury cars, she absolutely despised the man standing in front of her. Carter looked at her with pleading eyes, but she offered no sympathy. She raised her right hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound did not reach me, but the impact snapped his head to the side. It was a vicious, punishing blow. She did not wait for his reaction. She turned her back on him, pulled her silk robe tight around her shoulders, and marched back up the stone steps. She went inside and slammed the heavy oak doors, leaving him completely alone on the freezing driveway. She treated him with the exact same disposable cruelty he had shown his mother's Quilt. Carter stood frozen on the empty cobblestone. The tow trucks rumbled past him, carrying his beautiful, expensive toys down the long driveway and out through the iron gates. They drove right past my hidden truck, the flashing yellow lights reflecting off my windshield. I watched Carter slump, his shoulders completely broken. But then his posture suddenly changed. The paralyzing shock gave way to a frantic, desperate energy. He ran around the side of the massive house toward the smaller staff garage. A few moments later, a simple blue hybrid sedan backed out onto the driveway. It was an older model, likely something Vanessa had owned before she married into his fake wealth. The engine whined as Carter slammed the car into gear and sped down the driveway. The tires squealed aggressively against the stone as he tore through the open gates, taking the corner onto the main road with reckless speed. He drove straight past my parked truck, his eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead, completely unaware that the architect of his destruction was sitting 30 feet away drinking coffee. I watched his taillights fade into the morning traffic. I knew exactly where he was going. He was not heading to his corporate office downtown. The federal marshals and the banking regulators were undoubtedly swarming the glass tower right now, seizing servers and locking the doors. He was a hunted man with nowhere left to hide. He was heading to the only place he thought might hold the key to saving his skin. He was heading straight for my modest house in Quincy, hoping to find the black computer drive to destroy the evidence. I took a final slow sip of my hot coffee, screwed the cup back onto the thermos, and put the truck in gear. The trap at my house was already set, and I was ready to watch him walk right into it. I had parked my truck a few miles away from his gated community at a small, quiet diner, sitting in a vinyl booth near the back window. I ordered a cup of black coffee and set my cell phone flat on the scratched table. Yesterday afternoon, anticipating exactly how a rat behaves when cornered, I had hired a local security company to install a series of high-definition, hidden cameras inside and outside my modest home in Quincy. I knew my son better than anyone in the world. I knew that once his wealth was stripped away and his wife turned her back on him, his arrogance would immediately curdle into sheer blind panic. He would quickly realize that the only way to save himself from federal prison was to destroy the physical evidence of his financial crimes. He desperately needed that encrypted black computer drive. The screen on my phone suddenly lit up with a silent motion alert. I tapped the notification, and the live video feed buffered for a single second before revealing the small, concrete patio behind my house. Carter had parked his wife-blue hybrid car, half on the street curb and half on my overgrown front lawn. He stumbled out of the driver's seat looking completely deranged. He marched right up to my back door. He did not bother looking under the welcome mat for a spare key or even trying the brass handle. He raised his heavy leather shoe and kicked the wooden frame near the deadbolt with everything he had. The old weathered wood splintered instantly, and the door swung violently inward, banging loudly against the kitchen wall. I watched the camera feed automatically switch from the exterior patio to the interior kitchen view. He stumbled inside, bringing dead brown leaves and dirt onto my clean linoleum floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly around the small space. This was no longer the sophisticated real estate developer who drank expensive scotch with wealthy venture capitalists. This was a feral, cornered animal desperate to chew its own leg off to escape a steel trap. He started opening every single kitchen drawer, pulling them completely out of their tracks and dumping the contents directly onto the floor. Silverware, wooden spatulas, and old grocery receipts scattered everywhere. He was frantically looking for a safe, a metal lockbox, or the gray polymer pouch he assumed I had hidden. The live feed tracked his movements as he moved frantically into my small living room. He walked over to the tall wooden bookshelves I had built with my own 2 hands 20 years ago. He grabbed entire rows of books, sweeping them violently onto the carpet. Novels his mother used to read on quiet Sunday afternoons, and heavy leather photo albums from his own childhood, tumbled to the floor. He kicked the empty shelves, breaking the wooden slats in his blind rage. He grabbed the faded cushions off my worn sofa and threw them across the room, tearing at the fabric. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He was completely destroying the only real, authentic home he ever had, just to save his manufactured one. The most painful part to watch was when he entered my bedroom. This was the quiet sanctuary where Caroline had spent her final agonizing days. I watched through the small dome camera mounted on the ceiling as he grabbed the edge of my heavy mattress and flipped it completely over, knocking the bedside lamp to the hardwood floor. The glass bulb shattered into 100 jagged pieces. He opened my closet and started pulling my work clothes off the hangers, throwing my faded flannel shirts and heavy denim jeans into a massive pile. He dropped to his knees, patting down the carpet, looking for loose floorboards or a hidden floor safe. He was so completely consumed by his own greed and terror that he failed to realize how incredibly pathetic he looked crawling on the floor of the father he had so publicly humiliated. He was tearing my house apart looking for the black computer drive, but his desperate search was entirely in vain. He did not know that early yesterday morning, before the sun even came up, I had walked into the massive stone building of the federal courthouse downtown. I had sat in a sterile, brightly lit conference room with a senior prosecutor and 2 armed agents from the Financial Crimes Division. I had handed them the gray polymer pouch, the heavy brass key, and the encrypted drive. I had sat there drinking their terrible office coffee and watched them upload the entire history of his embezzlement, his forged signatures, and his offshore shell companies directly into their secure federal database. The evidence he was frantically searching for was currently sitting inside a heavily guarded evidence locker, completely out of his reach forever. By breaking into my house, he had not found salvation. He had only committed another massive, unforced error. Breaking and entering is a serious crime on its own, but when you commit a felony break-in while actively trying to destroy evidence in an ongoing federal fraud investigation, the legal consequences multiply exponentially. He was committing the crime of obstruction of justice and the spoliation of evidence, all captured in high-definition video. He was handing the federal government the final nail for his own coffin wrapped in a neat little bow. I did not call the local city police department. Local cops might just write it up as a domestic dispute or a simple property crime between angry family members. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts list, and tapped the direct cell phone number of the lead federal marshal assigned to his massive fraud case. The marshal answered on the second ring. The background noise on his end sounded like a busy, chaotic command center. I did not use a frantic or panicked tone. My voice was completely calm, cold, and steady. I identified myself and told the marshal that the primary suspect in his wire fraud case was currently committing a felony break and entering at my private residence. I informed him that the suspect was actively attempting to locate and destroy physical evidence related to the financial investigation. I gave the marshal my exact home address in Quincy and told him I had a live video feed of the suspect actively destroying the interior of the property. The tone of the marshal shifted immediately from bureaucratic efficiency to sharp tactical urgency. He told me to stay exactly where I was and to keep the line open. I could hear him shouting orders to his team in the background, dispatching multiple armed units directly to my house. I sat in the quiet diner, taking a slow sip of my cooling black coffee, watching the live video feed on my screen. Carter was now sitting on the floor of my ruined bedroom, surrounded by my scattered clothes and broken furniture, holding his head in his hands. He was crying. They were not tears of remorse for what he had done to his family, but tears of absolute self-pity because he could not find the magic key to save his fake empire. He thought the worst thing that could happen today was losing his luxury cars. He had absolutely no idea that the flashing lights speeding toward my house right now were coming to take away his freedom forever. I watched the live video feed on my phone screen as the heavy splintered wooden door of my house was pushed open by 3 federal marshals wearing dark tactical gear. Carter was sitting on the floor of my ruined bedroom, completely exhausted from his frantic, desperate search. The marshals did not politely read him his rights or ask him to come quietly. They hauled him to his feet, shoved him hard against the wall, and pulled his arms roughly behind his back. The loud metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed clearly through the small microphone on my camera. He looked absolutely terrified. He begged them to let him make a phone call to his lawyer, but they simply marched him out of my house and shoved him into the back of an unmarked black vehicle. By 4 in the afternoon, the local business journals had already published the breaking news online. His booking photograph was plastered across every single financial website in the state. The arrogant real estate genius was suddenly exposed as a common criminal wearing a wrinkled gray sweater with red puffy eyes and a look of absolute devastation. The rapid public destruction of his carefully crafted image was brutal and incredibly efficient. The next morning, I woke up long before dawn, just like I had done every single day for the last 40 years. I did not go to my closet to find a tailored suit. I did not own an expensive blazer or a silk tie, and I absolutely refused to wear a costume to face the men who had profited off my stolen life. I pulled on a thick, faded flannel shirt, my heavy denim work jeans, and my scuffed leather work boots. I wrapped fresh white medical gauze around my blistering hands. I drove my old Ford truck right into the heart of the downtown financial district and pulled into the underground parking garage of the towering glass skyscraper Carter claimed to own. I parked my rusted truck directly in the spot, labeled Chief Executive Officer. I walked into the massive marble lobby and bypassed the long security line. I approached the main reception desk and handed the terrified young woman my driver license, along with a certified copy of the federal injunction. She looked at my worn boots and then looked at the legal document, proving I was the sole legal owner of the entire building. Her hands shook violently as she handed me an all-access security badge. I took the private executive elevator all the way to the top floor of the tower. The polished metal doors slid open to reveal a massive glass-walled boardroom overlooking the entire city skyline. 12 board members were already seated around a massive, polished oak table. These were the senior vice presidents, the financial officers, and the legal advisors who had blindly helped Carter build his fake empire. They were all wearing expensive dark suits, staring at their phones and whispering frantically to one another about the federal raid. The room fell completely dead silent the moment I walked through the glass doors. They looked at my flannel shirt, my worn work boots, and my thick bandaged hands with utter confusion. They were expecting a team of ruthless federal regulators or a group of corporate liquidators to walk in. They had absolutely no idea who I was until I walked directly to the head of the table and took the large leather executive chair that previously belonged to my son. I placed a thick manila folder on the polished wood and looked at the terrified faces surrounding me. I spoke clearly and slowly, letting my words carry the heavy weight of absolute, undeniable authority. I told them my name, and I informed them that as of yesterday morning, I was the majority shareholder and sole legal owner of Apex Holdings. I did not give them a chance to introduce themselves or offer fake condolences about the arrest of my son. I dictated the new reality of their lives with surgical precision. I told them Carter is permanently out. He has been completely removed from every single corporate registry and stripped of all operational authority. I watched their faces turn a sickening shade of pale white as I outlined the immediate future of the holding company. I announced that the entire massive corporation, along with every single subsidiary and commercial property, would be completely liquidated starting today. I told them the incoming funds from the massive fire sale would be used to immediately pay back the hundreds of honest blue-collar contractors Carter had stiffed over the years. The remaining massive balance would be used to fully reimburse my stolen retirement fund with a full decade of heavy compounding interest. I told them their lucrative salaries, their massive quarterly bonuses, and their comfortable golden parachutes were completely erased as of this exact second. Suddenly, a younger executive sitting near the middle of the table stood up. He was a close personal friend of my son, a man who had directly benefited from the illegal offshore accounts. His face was red with arrogant anger as he slammed his hand down hard on the polished wood table. He started shouting about corporate bylaws and fiduciary duties, threatening to file a massive class action lawsuit against me to stop the liquidation process. He claimed I had no right to walk in off the street and destroy their wealthy livelihoods. I did not raise my voice or argue with him. I did not need to defend my position to a thief. I simply reached into my manila folder and pulled out a single piece of white paper. It was a copy of a massive fraudulent wire transfer Carter had authorized 5 years ago to drain my bank account. Right next to my forged signature was the clear, undisputed signature of this younger executive acting as the verifying witness. I slid the paper across the polished oak table until it stopped right in front of him. I looked him dead in the eye and told him calmly that if he objected one more time, I would personally hand that specific document to the federal prosecutor and ensure he shared a concrete prison cell with my son. The young executive looked down at the undeniable proof of his own felony, and the blood completely drained from his face. He physically recoiled from the table, falling back heavily into his leather chair and shutting his mouth completely. He did not say another word. He just stared at the table in absolute terror. I looked around the room at the remaining board members and asked if anyone else had any legal objections to the immediate liquidation of the company. The silence in the glass room was absolute and profound. No one dared to make eye contact with me. I called for a formal board vote to immediately dissolve the corporation and sell off all remaining assets. Every single hand in that room went up in terrified, unanimous agreement. They were voting to end their own careers simply to avoid going to federal prison. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and picked up my manila folder. I walked out of the glass boardroom and took the elevator back down to my old Ford truck. In less than 10 minutes, the entire fake empire Carter had spent 10 years building on my broken back was completely dismantled and legally erased from the earth. It took Carter 48 hours to crawl his way out of the federal holding facility. because the government had completely frozen his legitimate bank accounts, and I had officially liquidated his corporate assets. He had absolutely no clean money to secure a standard bail bond. No reputable agency would touch a man facing 32 counts of federal wire fraud with zero collateral. Desperation forces a man into incredibly dark corners. He used his permitted phone calls to reach out to a predatory loan shark, a dangerous element of the city underworld he had occasionally used to quietly intimidate stubborn union contractors. He secured his release, but he sold his soul to do it at borrowing massive amounts of cash at a staggering interest rate he could never possibly repay. He stepped out of the county jail late Wednesday afternoon, looking absolutely nothing like the polished real estate mogul he pretended to be. He was completely defeated. He had a dark purple bruise forming along his jawline from a brief violent altercation inside the holding cell, and he was still wearing the same filthy gray sweater and torn dress pants from the morning of his arrest. He did not have a phone or a wallet, so he convinced a shady cab driver to take him back to his sprawling Connecticut estate, promising a massive payout from a hidden safe once he got inside. The cab dropped him off at the edge of his pristine suburban neighborhood and sped away, leaving him standing alone in the damp evening fog. He walked the last half-mile up the winding road, expecting to retreat into the warm, luxurious safety of his massive fortress. He expected Vanessa to be waiting for him, perhaps angry, but ready to help him formulate a plan to hide from the authorities. He needed a hot shower, a stiff drink, and a warm bed to plot his revenge. But as he approached the familiar stone pillars marking the entrance to his property, he stopped dead in his tracks. The massive wrought iron gates were pulled tightly shut. Wrapped around the thick iron bars was a heavy industrial steel chain secured by a massive solid brass padlock. Carter stumbled forward, gripping the cold metal with his bare hands. He pushed and pulled frantically, but the heavy gates did not budge a single inch. Pinned to the center of the ironwork right over his custom-designed monogram was a bright orange piece of paper sealed in a thick plastic sleeve. It was an official notice of property seizure issued by the federal authorities. Right beneath it was a second stark white sign printed with bold black letters stating that the property was now under the exclusive legal control of Apex Holdings, and any unauthorized entry would result in immediate criminal prosecution. Carter stared at the signs, his tired brain struggling to process the absolute finality of the situation. He looked through the bars up the long, sweeping cobblestone driveway. The mansion was completely dark. There were no warm lights glowing in the windows, and no luxury cars parked near the entrance. He began to panic, shaking the gates so violently that the heavy chain rattled loudly against the iron, echoing through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. He started screaming for his wife, begging Vanessa to come downstairs and open the side pedestrian gate. But Vanessa was long gone. The moment the federal marshals had arrived to secure the perimeter. Earlier that day, she had realized the money was truly gone forever. She had packed whatever designer clothes and loose jewelry she could stuff into a few suitcases called a private car, and completely abandoned him. She did not leave a note, and she did not plan on ever coming back. Carter was completely alone, standing on the wrong side of the wall he had built to keep the rest of the world out. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the large oak trees lining the inside of the driveway. I had been waiting there for nearly an hour, anticipating his arrival. I walked slowly down the cobblestone path, the gravel crunching softly beneath my heavy work boots. Carter stopped shaking the gates when he saw my silhouette approaching. As I stepped into the pale light of the street lamp, his eyes widened in absolute shock, and then narrowed into a desperate, furious glare. I stopped just a few feet away from him, separated only by the heavy iron bars. I did not say a word. I simply reached into the pocket of my faded corduroy jacket and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. They clinked softly in the quiet night air. They were the master keys to the entire estate, legally handed over to me by the federal marshals after the property was secured under my holding company. Carter stared at the keys dangling from my bandaged fingers, and the last remaining shred of his sanity finally snapped. He grabbed the iron bars, wrapping his hands so tightly around the metal that his knuckles turned completely white. He pressed his bruised face against the cold iron and began to scream. He demanded that I open the gate immediately. He yelled that he had a legal right to enter his own home, claiming this was a massive misunderstanding and that he would have me arrested for trespassing. When I did not react to his empty threats, his tone completely shifted from aggressive rage to pathetic whimpering. He dropped to his knees on the damp pavement, still gripping the bars. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his dirty face and began to beg. He sobbed that he had absolutely nowhere to go. He cried that Vanessa had completely abandoned him, that his wealthy friends were ignoring his calls, and that dangerous men were coming to collect the bail money he owed them. He pleaded with me to let him hide in the basement just for one night. I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt on the public street. I looked at his expensive, tailored pants now ruined and stained with mud. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I remembered the intense, agonizing heat of the artificial flames searing the flesh of my palms. I remembered the smell of the burning cotton and the beautiful blue threads turning into black ash. I remembered the cruel, mocking laughter of his wealthy friends and the utter, absolute disdain in his voice when he threw his dying mother, final act of unconditional love, into the fire. I stepped closer to the gate until I was looking directly down into his desperate, tear-filled eyes. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly calm so he would have to strain to hear every single syllable. I told him he was standing outside a property legally owned by a man he had completely destroyed. I paused for a long moment, letting the absolute silence of the neighborhood amplify my final sentence. I repeated the exact words he had so proudly spoken to me just a few nights ago. Trash does not belong in my mansion, Carter. I did not wait for his response. I did not stay to watch him cry or listen to his pathetic apologies. I turned my back on him, sliding the heavy brass keys back into my jacket pocket. I began the long, slow walk up the cobblestone driveway toward the massive, dark house. Behind me, Carter began to scream my name, his voice tearing through the quiet, affluent street, filled with pure, unadulterated agony. He rattled the heavy steel chain and kicked the iron bars, but the gate held perfectly firm. I did not turn around. I walked up the wide stone steps, unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, and stepped inside. I closed the door firmly behind me, engaging the deadbolt with a loud, heavy click. The sound completely severed the final connection between us, leaving him locked out of his own life, shivering on the dark street, waiting for the monsters he had borrowed from to finally come and collect their debt. Vanessa did not wait around to see the federal authorities lock the heavy iron gates of the estate. She had packed her most expensive leather suitcases the very moment she realized the bank accounts were permanently frozen over the weekend. She hired a private car service on a lingering corporate tab and fled to a luxury hotel downtown. She ordered expensive room service and drank vintage champagne, trying to calm her nerves. She truly believed she could simply walk away from the massive financial crater my son had created. She thought her beauty and her perceived wealth would easily shield her from the brutal consequences of his actions. She planned to distance herself completely, to play the role of the innocent, betrayed wife. But when she tried to pay for her extended stay the next morning, the hotel concierge politely informed her that every single credit card she presented was completely blocked. The reality of her situation began to close in around her with terrifying speed. She needed liquid cash immediately. She needed to hire a ruthless, high-powered divorce attorney to completely sever her legal ties to Carter before the federal government started looking into her own extravagant spending habits. She retreated to her hotel suite and opened her leather travel case. She pulled out the heavy velvet boxes containing her most prized possessions. Inside rested her massive 6-carat diamond engagement ring, her matching diamond wedding band, and 3 heavy platinum tennis bracelets. These were the items she had proudly flashed at country club luncheons and charity galas, using them as physical proof of her absolute superiority over everyone else. She believed she was holding at least $500,000 in precious stones. She dressed in a sleek, dark designer suit, put on her oversized sunglasses, and walked confidently out of the hotel. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of an exclusive high-end jeweler located in the center of the Diamond District. She walked into the quiet, heavily guarded showroom, with the exact same arrogant posture she had displayed when she mocked Caroline and her handmade quilt. The showroom was pristine with bright halogen lights reflecting off the spotless glass display cases. She approached the senior appraiser, an older man wearing a dark tailored suit and a jeweler loop around his neck. She placed the velvet boxes on the velvet mat and pushed them aggressively across the glass counter. She demanded an immediate cash appraisal, claiming she was simply liquidating some old pieces she no longer wore because they bored her. The appraiser opened the boxes and carefully extracted the massive engagement ring. He did not look impressed by the sheer size of the stone. He placed his magnifying loupe over his right eye and held the ring up directly under the harsh white inspection light. He turned the metal, slowly examining the prongs, the facets, and the way the light refracted through the center stone. He then picked up a small electronic diamond tester pen and pressed the metal tip against the flat top of the main jewel. The small device emitted a flat, dull tone, and a red light illuminated on the side, indicating a complete failure. The appraiser lowered the ring and removed his loupe. He looked at Vanessa with a mixture of professional pity and mild annoyance. He placed the ring gently back onto the velvet mat and slid the boxes back toward her. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone, informing her that he could not offer her any money for the pieces. Vanessa immediately bristled, her face flushing with arrogant anger. She insulted his professional expertise, claiming the ring was purchased for $300,000 and demanding to speak to the owner of the establishment. The appraiser simply shook his head and explained the brutal, undeniable truth. He told her the stones were cubic zirconia. They were nothing more than high-quality cut glass set in cheap rhodium-plated silver. They were completely worthless. Vanessa stood frozen at the glass counter, her mouth open in absolute shock. Her mind raced back to a specific morning exactly 6 months ago. Carter had come into her massive dressing room, telling her he wanted to take all of her fine jewelry to a specialist for a professional ultrasonic cleaning and prong tightening. He had been incredibly insistent, packing the pieces himself and taking them away for 3 entire days. She had thought it was a sweet, romantic gesture from a wealthy husband. Now standing in the harsh, unforgiving light out of the Diamond District, the sickening reality washed over her. Carter had not taken her jewelry to be cleaned. He had taken it to a pawn shop. He had been drowning in the massive hidden debt of his offshore shell companies long before I ever brought the quilt to his housewarming party. He had been so desperate to make the crushing interest payments on his fraudulent loans that he had stolen his own wife and her diamonds, sold them for cash, and completely replaced them with cheap glass replicas. She had spent the last 6 months parading around the wealthiest circles in the city, completely unaware that she was wearing fake jewelry funded by my stolen retirement. The illusion of her grand, superior lifestyle was entirely shattered by the deceit of the man she had married solely for money. She grabbed the velvet boxes with trembling hands, shoved them into her designer purse, and stumbled out of the jewelry store. She was entirely broke. She had absolutely no cash to hire a lawyer, no money to pay for her luxury hotel suite, and nowhere left to hide. When she returned to the hotel, the security staff forced her to vacate her room, leaving her standing on the busy downtown sidewalk with her heavy leather suitcases. She was completely humiliated, stripped of the fake wealth that had defined her entire existence. With her final few dollars, she boarded a crowded public city bus. She sat in the very back row, clutching her heavy bags, as the bus slowly drove away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. She watched through the dirty window as the scenery changed from pristine, manicured avenues to the cracked pavement and faded storefronts of the lower middle-class neighborhood where she had grown up. She walked the last 3 blocks, dragging her heavy luggage behind her, until she reached a small, cramped apartment building. She had spent her entire adult life trying to escape this exact place, swearing she would never return to the humble life her hardworking parents provided. She had looked down on people who lived in these buildings, treating them like dirt beneath her expensive shoes. Now she had absolutely no other choice. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs, her designer heels clicking softly against the worn floorboards. She stood in front of their chipped, painted door, a completely broken woman returning to the very reality she thought she was too good for. The absolute destruction of her vanity was a perfect silent justice. She raised her hand and knocked on the wood, forced to beg for the exact same basic shelter she had once mocked me for having. The financial collapse had not just ruined my son. It had completely exposed the shallow, empty foundation of the woman who had laughed at his mother-dying gift. They were both finally paying the absolute price for their boundless, arrogant greed. A full week had passed since the heavy iron gates of the luxury estate were padlocked shut by federal authorities. The frantic, chaotic energy of the initial raids, the corporate liquidation, and the public humiliation had slowly settled into a cold, quiet reality. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when I decided to visit the local cemetery. I stopped at a small independent florist on the corner of my street and bought a large, beautiful bouquet of fresh blue hydrangeas. They were Caroline's favorite flowers. She used to grow massive, vibrant bushes of them along the side of our modest house, tending to the soil with such gentle, deliberate care, even when her illness began to drain her strength. I drove through the tall, wrought iron gates of the quiet memorial park, feeling the familiar heavy ache in my chest that always accompanied my visits. I parked my old Ford truck on the side of the winding paved road and walked slowly down the manicured green paths, listening to the cold morning wind rustling through the high branches of the old oak trees. As I approached the gentle crest of the hill where my wife was buried, I noticed a figure sitting on the damp morning grass directly next to her polished granite headstone. It was Carter. I stopped walking for a long moment, simply standing on the path and observing the man who had caused so much profound destruction in our lives. He looked absolutely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant real estate developer who had stood holding court with millionaire investors just 2 weeks ago. He had seemingly aged 10 years in the short span of 7 days. He was completely unshaven, his face covered in a dark, coarse shadow of stubble, and his skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled suit he had worn to his federal arraignment hearing earlier that week. The expensive fabric was stained with dirt and sweat hanging loosely off his frame, as if he had stopped eating entirely. He looked like a hollow, empty shell of a human being, completely drained of the toxic vanity that used to fuel his every move. He heard the heavy tread of my work boots crunching against the gravel path and slowly turned his head. When he saw me standing there holding the blue flowers, a profound, pathetic desperation washed over his exhausted face. He did not stand up to greet me as a man. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet and then immediately dropped back down onto both of his knees right there in the damp cemetery dirt. He clasped his dirty hands together in front of his chest, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. He began to speak, his voice trembling and cracking under the heavy, crushing weight of his absolute terror. He begged me to listen to him. He said the federal prosecutors were completely dismantling every single aspect of his life. They had presented his court-appointed lawyer with a massive, insurmountable stack of undeniable evidence proving his extensive wire fraud, his relentless embezzlement, and his forged signatures. He told me the government was offering him a strict plea deal of 10 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. 10 entire years of his life locked inside a cold concrete cell, stripped of his freedom, his status, and his future. He was weeping openly, now heavy tears streaming down his dirty cheeks, dripping onto the collar of his ruined, expensive suit. He reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the hem of my faded corduroy jacket, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his pride. He pleaded with me to drop the massive civil lawsuit I had filed against him on behalf of the holding company. He begged me to walk into the federal courthouse and tell the judge that the entire complex financial arrangement was just a massive family misunderstanding. He actually claimed that if I lied to the authorities and told them I had secretly authorized the offshore transfers, he could avoid federal prison entirely and just receive a sentence of probation. He looked up at me, his face contorted in selfish agony, and cried out that he was my son. That single desperate phrase echoed through the quiet cemetery, hanging heavily in the cold morning air. I am your son. It was the exact same phrase he had weaponized to manipulate me his entire life. As I stood there looking down at him, the entire dripping backstory of our relationship flashed through my mind with sickening, undeniable clarity. This pathetic moment was the exact culmination of a lifetime of actively avoiding consequences. When he was 7 years old, he threw his brand new bicycle down a rocky ravine simply because he was angry about losing a neighborhood race. He came to me crying, and I spent 3 days rebuilding the bent metal frame and replacing the broken chain instead of making him earn the money for a new one. When he was 20 years old, he maxed out 3 different high-interest credit cards, partying in college, completely ruining his credit score. He called me in a panic, and I drained my meager savings account to pay off his reckless debt so he would not get evicted from his apartment. And when he wanted to play real estate mogul, I had mortgaged the successful contracting business I built with my own blood and sweat to finance his arrogant dreams. I had spent my entire adult life acting as his permanent safety net. Every single time he made a destructive, selfish choice, I had rushed in to soften the blow, shielding him from the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. My blind, unconditional love had completely crippled his moral compass. I had accidentally taught him that he could inflict massive damage on the people around him and absolutely never have to pay the ultimate price. He was kneeling in the dirt right now, not because he was genuinely sorry for destroying my retirement or for treating his dying mother final gift like common garbage. He was crying because he genuinely believed I would reach down, pick him up, and fix this massive disaster, just like I had fixed his broken bicycle. He fully expected me to commit federal perjury and risk my own freedom just to save him one final time. I slowly pulled the hem of my jacket out of his trembling grip. I stepped right past him, completely ignoring his frantic, desperate sobbing. I knelt down gracefully and placed the fresh blue hydrangeas gently against the base of Carolyn headstone. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet floral scent mixed with the damp earth. I reached out and rested my bandaged hands flat against the cold, polished granite, drawing immense strength from the memory of the brilliant, strong woman resting beneath it. I stood back up and looked down at the pathetic, broken man still kneeling in the dirt. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but the words were forged from solid, unbending steel. I told him that I had spent 40 years building bridges for him to walk across, and he had deliberately chosen to burn every single one of them to the ground. I told him the fire he started in his grand living room was the very last fire I would ever pull him out of. I looked deeply into his terrified, bloodshot eyes and told him it was finally time to face the absolute consequences of his own actions. Carter let out a loud, agonizing wail, covering his face with his dirty hands, collapsing completely forward until his forehead rested heavily against the damp cemetery grass. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging me not to leave him, begging for a second chance that he absolutely did not deserve. I did not offer him a hand to help him up. I did not offer him a single word of false comfort or empty hope. I turned my back on him and began walking slowly back down the long green path toward my old truck. The sound of his bitter weeping echoed behind me, bouncing off the stone monuments, completely ignored by the peaceful world around us. I walked away, leaving him exactly where he belonged, buried under the massive, crushing weight of his own unforgivable sins. The federal courthouse was a massive structure of cold gray stone and thick bulletproof glass. It was a place designed to make every single person walking through its doors feel incredibly small and entirely subject to the absolute unyielding power of the law. I sat in the very back row of the public gallery, wearing my usual clean flannel shirt and dark denim jeans. I did not sit behind the defense table to show parental support or offer any silent encouragement. I sat near the heavy wooden doors, acting as an impartial observer to the final chapter of my son and his complete destruction. Carter sat at the large, polished oak table at the front of the room, wearing a cheap, oversized suit provided by his overworked public defender. He kept looking back over his shoulder, scanning the crowded room with desperate, bloodshot eyes. He was looking for his wealthy investor friends, or perhaps hoping that Vanessa had suddenly grown a conscience and come to support him in his darkest hour. But the gallery was completely empty of anyone from his previous luxurious life. His high society friends had scattered the moment the federal indictments were unsealed, terrified of being implicated in his massive web of financial fraud. He was completely and utterly alone, facing the crushing weight of the federal government. The heavy wooden door next to the bench swung open, and the federal judge took his seat. The entire courtroom stood in absolute silence. The judge was an older man with a stern, deeply lined face who had built his long-respected career on showing absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. He looked down at the thick stack of papers resting on his desk, and then looked directly at Carter. The foreman of the jury stood up to read the final verdict. The words echoed off the high ceiling, hitting the quiet room with the heavy, devastating force of a sledgehammer. Guilty on count 1 of wire fraud. Guilty on count 2 of corporate embezzlement. Guilty on count 3 of aggravated identity theft and forgery. The foreman continued reading down the long, exhausting list, outlining every single stolen dollar and every single forged document my wife had so meticulously tracked. There were 32 felony counts in total. With every single word of affirmation, Carter seemed to physically shrink in his wooden chair, his shoulders collapsing inward, as the sheer magnitude of his crimes was officially entered into the permanent federal record. Before handing down the final sentence, the judge leaned forward, folding his hands, and spoke directly to my son. The judge noted that the most reprehensible aspect of this entire criminal enterprise was not the massive amount of money stolen from honest blue-collar contractors or the fraudulent loans secured from downtown banks. The judge stated that the true tragedy was the profound, malicious betrayal of the very family that had sacrificed everything to give the defendant a solid foundation in life. The judge looked toward the back of the courtroom, making brief, silent eye contact with me, before turning his severe, unforgiving gaze back to Carter. He stated that because there had been no cooperation during the investigation, no genuine remorse shown to the victims, and absolutely no intervention from the primary victim to ask for any form of leniency, the court would impose the maximum penalty allowed by the strict federal guidelines. Carter was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel fell, hitting the sounding block with a sharp, loud crack. That single sound marked the absolute definitive end of his fake empire. 2 federal marshals immediately stepped forward, pulling Carter roughly to his feet and escorting him through the side door to begin his long, dark decade behind concrete walls. The legal system moves incredibly slow, but the financial recovery process is merciless and incredibly fast. 3 months after the heavy iron doors of the federal prison locked behind my son, the government began liquidating the physical remnants of his fraudulent life to pay restitution. The sprawling Connecticut mansion where this entire nightmare began was put up for public auction on the broad stone steps of the county courthouse. It was a brisk Tuesday morning when I arrived holding a certified bank draft secured by the fully recovered and legally cleared assets of Apex Holdings. Several wealthy developers and aggressive real estate speculators had gathered to bid on the massive property, hoping to score a lucrative deal on a distressed luxury asset. They looked at my faded jacket and work boots and immediately dismissed me as a lost bystander. But I was not there to make a profit. I was there to reclaim the ground where my wife and her final beautiful gift had been so cruelly disrespected. As the auctioneer began calling out the rising numbers, I simply raised my numbered paddle and kept it raised. The aggressive speculators tried to run the price up, trying to intimidate me out of the bidding war. I did not flinch. I systematically outbid every single wealthy man in the crowd, using the very money Carter had stolen from my retirement to buy back the fortress he had built. When the auctioneer finally shouted sold, the massive estate legally belonged to me, free and clear. I did not want to live in that house. The imported marble floors and the grand vaulted ceilings were permanently stained by the toxic memory of his extreme vanity. I had absolutely no desire to sleep in the massive master bedroom or walk the manicured grounds where he had laughed at my burned hands. The very next morning, I drove my old truck to the headquarters of a prominent local nonprofit organization that specialized in providing comprehensive housing and medical support for displaced military veterans. I sat down with the director of the charity, a retired Marine who had dedicated his post-military life to helping broken men rebuild their lives. I handed him the thick folder containing the original clean deed to the Connecticut estate, transferring 100% of the property ownership directly into their charitable trust. I told him they could retrofit the massive mansion into a state-of-the-art recovery facility, or sell the vast surrounding acreage to fully fund their medical operations for the next 20 years. The director was completely speechless, staring at the legal documents, with tears welling up in his tough, weathered eyes. He asked me why a man would give away such an incredibly valuable piece of real estate without asking for a single thing in return. I simply told him that the property had been built on a rotten foundation of lies and theft, and it was finally time for the ground to serve a truly honorable purpose. A few weeks later, I drove my truck back to the affluent neighborhood for one final visit. I parked on the street exactly where I had parked on the night of the terrible housewarming party. The charity had immediately decided to alter the property to suit their operational needs, and their very first step was removing the massive barriers my son had erected to keep people like me away. The wealthy neighbors stood on their pristine lawns whispering in panicked tones as they watched the events unfold. I stood on the damp grass leaning against the hood of my truck and watched as a massive yellow bulldozer rolled up the long cobblestone driveway. The heavy diesel engine roared, filling the quiet suburban street with the glorious sound of heavy industry. The operator lowered the massive steel blade and drove directly into the towering wrought iron gates. The heavy stone pillars cracked loudly and crumbled into a cloud of white dust. The thick iron bars twisted and snapped under the immense mechanical pressure, falling heavily to the ground with a satisfying metallic crash. I watched the physical symbols of my son and his arrogant exclusion completely destroyed, reduced to a pile of broken rubble in a matter of minutes. The false empire he had built was completely leveled, and the earth beneath it was finally salted. The cold air felt incredibly clean in my lungs. Justice had not just been served in a quiet, sterile courtroom. It had been executed with absolute, undeniable finality right there on the exact spot where his betrayal began. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power never roars. It does not need expensive suits or imported cars to prove its worth. True power is incredibly quiet. It is the silent, meticulous preparation of a mother and the cold, calculated patience of a father. We often mistake arrogance for strength and silence for weakness, but arrogance is incredibly fragile, built entirely on lies and stolen money. When you treat the people who gave you everything like disposable trash, you are not asserting dominance. You are simply digging your own grave. The truth always survives the fire, and justice always collects its absolute debt. If you believe that arrogance always gets exactly what it deserves, in the end, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.